On a clear day, Mount Shasta is visible from more than 100 miles away, rising alone out of the northern California landscape with no other peak nearby tall enough to compete with it. A single snow-capped volcano standing in isolation, the kind of landmark that would dominate the horizon even if nobody had ever told a single story about it. And for at least 9,000 years, the people living in its shadow have described it as something considerably more specific than a scenic backdrop. Not a mountain that happens to look impressive, a mountain that something actually lives inside. The version of that story most people have heard involves a lost civilization called Lemuria, a hidden city named Telos, and beings who supposedly emerged from tunnels beneath the peak to walk unnoticed through the streets of the small town at its base. That version is almost entirely a 20th century invention. The real story is older, stranger in its own way, and comes from the Karuk, Wintu, Shasta, Modoc, and Klamath peoples who were here first. And what they actually say lives inside this mountain has almost nothing to do with a lost continent. This is Mount Shasta. By the end of this video, you're going to understand what Indigenous tradition actually says is inside this mountain, how a 19th century novelist's fiction got mistaken for ancient prophecy, what real physical features of the mountain gave that fiction just enough plausibility to survive for over a century, and why, even after all of that gets sorted out, the original reason native peoples consider this place sacred is more remarkable than the myth that tried to replace it. This isn't a story about debunking a legend for the sake of it. It's about two entirely different traditions attached to the same mountain, one 9,000 years old and still actively practiced, the other roughly 130 years old and built almost entirely out of fiction. And untangling which matters more than most people realize. Start with what's actually documented. Mount Shasta sits at the meeting point of at least 4 indigenous territories, the Shasta, Modoc, Wintu and Achamowi, with the Karuk and Klamath peoples holding it in view and in reverence as well, even from outside its immediate boundary. Archaeological evidence places continuous human habitation in the surrounding area back roughly 7,000 years, with some artifacts suggesting activity as far back as 9,000. For all of these nations independently, this mountain occupies the same role, the center of creation itself. According to Shasta tradition, the Great Spirit made the mountain first, pushing down ice and snow through a hole in the sky until it formed a peak solid enough to step onto. And only then, standing on the mountain he'd just created, did he go on to make the rest of the world. Trees, rivers formed from melting snow, birds breathed into being from leaves, fish made from twigs cast into streams, animals made from branches thrown into the forest. In this telling, Mount Shasta isn't simply the tallest, most visible landmark in the region. It's the literal origin point everything else was built outward from, not a backdrop to creation, but its starting coordinate. There's a second layer to the Shasta tradition worth noting here too, involving a great bear that offended the Great Spirit and was punished by being forced onto 4 legs, its children scattered across the earth as a consequence, a detail that, whatever its deeper meaning, reinforces the same pattern running through nearly every tradition tied to this mountain. Consequences here are physical, permanent, and written directly into the landscape, or the animal kingdom itself, not abstract morals detached from the world the story is describing. The Klamath and Modoc traditions describe something different but related. Skell, the spirit of the above world, descending from the sky to make his home at Shasta's summit, in a story tied directly to the same conflict that formed Crater Lake to the north, where Skell's rival Lau was ultimately driven down into the earth beneath Mount Mazama. And the Karuk call the mountain Uitaku, White Mountain, treating it, like the others, not as scenery, but as a living presence deserving of ongoing ceremony. That ceremony hasn't stopped. The Wintu still perform ritual dances each year specifically to ensure the continued flow of the mountain's sacred springs. Medicine men and women from multiple tribes have used specific sites on Shasta's slopes for centuries as places of vision quest, healing, and spiritual training. practices still carried out today, not preserved only in historical accounts. This is, by every measure available, a living religious tradition, not a closed chapter of folklore. So if the actual indigenous tradition centers on creation, on spirit, on an ongoing relationship between specific peoples and a mountain they've never stopped honoring, where did the buried city come from? And why does almost everyone who's heard of Mount Shasta know that version instead of this one? The answer starts with a novel. In 1894, a writer named Frederick Spencer Oliver published a book called A Dweller on Two Planets, which he claimed to have written through psychic dictation from a spirit guide, allegedly composing much of it as a teenager while resting his writing hand on a plank balanced across the arms of a chair, guided, he said, by a presence not entirely his own. Buried inside that novel was a description of a secret, technologically advanced civilization living inside Mount Shasta. Refugees, in Oliver's telling, from the lost continent of Lemuria, hiding out in a city beneath the peak after their homeland sank beneath the Pacific, complete with descriptions of advanced technology and underground temple architecture that read, even by the standards of 1890s pulp fiction, as vividly specific. Oliver's book was fiction. He called it fiction. It was published, marketed and sold as a novel sitting on bookstore shelves next to other speculative fiction of its era. But the specific, vivid detail he included, tunnels, a hidden underground city, survivors of a vanished ancient civilization, was compelling enough that within a few decades other writers started treating it less like a story and more like a claim, quietly dropping the fictional framing every time the tale got retold by someone one step further removed from the original source. In 1925, a writer using the pseudonym Selvius published an article called Descendants of Lemuria, which took Oliver's fictional premise and presented it as something closer to first-hand testimony, describing supposed sightings of robed, barefoot Lemurians walking quietly through the streets of the town of Mount Shasta itself, before vanishing back toward the mountain. There was no verified source behind these sightings, but the article spread, and the fictional premise from a novel published 30 years earlier had by this point been laundered into something people were starting to discuss as genuine local lore. Then, in the 1930s, a man named Guy Warren Ballard took the mythology considerably further. Ballard claimed that while hiking on Mount Shasta, he personally met an ascended being called Saint-Germain, who revealed hidden spiritual teachings to him directly, describing an encounter vivid enough in its detail that Ballard wrote entire books around it under the pen name Godfrey Ray King. Ballard turned that encounter into the foundation of an entirely new religious movement called the I Am activity, a real organized spiritual movement that gained a substantial following across the United States in the 1930s, complete with its own publications, its own gathering places, and its own internal theology built directly on the premise that ascended masters were real, accessible, and specifically reachable through Mount Shasta. It still exists in some form today, decades after Ballard's death. Whatever you make of Ballard's personal claims, the practical effect was enormous. A piece of 19th century pulp fiction had, within 2 generations, become the founding scripture of an actual religious movement, anchored specifically to this one mountain, complete with its own believers willing to organize their entire spiritual lives around it. By the time later writers introduced the name most people associate with the legend today, Telos, the supposed underground city itself, populated by an advanced, peaceful civilization, descended from Lemuria. The story had travelled so far from its original fictional source that most people encountering it for the first time had no idea it started as a novel at all. Here's where the story could easily collapse into simple debunking. But that's not quite fair to what actually happened next, because Mount Shasta gave this entirely fictional mythology just enough real physical cover to keep it alive for over a century. Start with the mountain itself. Shasta is a genuine active stratovolcano, the largest volcanic peak in the continental United States, rising to over 14,000 feet, with geologists estimating its formation began roughly 600,000 years ago. It last erupted in 1786, meaning it's not a dormant curiosity, but a live volcanic system, still capable of producing exactly the kind of geological activity: steam vents, thermal features, genuine cave systems formed by ancient lava flows that could plausibly hide something beneath the surface, at least to someone determined to believe it. Add to that one of the mountain's most consistently photographed natural phenomena: lenticular clouds, smooth saucer-shaped formations that regularly form directly over Shasta's peak due to the specific way wind interacts with its isolated extreme elevation, undisturbed by any neighbouring peak that might break up the airflow. These clouds have been mistaken for UFOs by visitors for decades, feeding directly into a broader mythology of the mountain as a site of otherworldly activity, completely independent of anything Oliver, Selvius or Ballard ever wrote. A tourist with a camera doesn't need to have read A Dweller on Two Planets to walk away from Mount Shasta convinced they've witnessed something unexplained. The mountain does a fair amount of that work on its own, and there really are documented lava tube caves on and around the mountain, genuine geological features formed by flowing lava that cooled on the outside while still moving underneath, leaving hollow tunnels behind once the flow stopped. None of these documented caves have ever produced a shred of evidence for an underground city, an advanced civilization, or anything resembling Telos. But their simple existence gave storytellers exactly the kind of literal physical loophole they needed. Real tunnels, real hollow spaces beneath a real active volcano, close enough to the fictional premise that skeptics couldn't dismiss the whole idea with a flat, "there's nothing under there at all." So what can actually be supported once you separate the documented geology from the borrowed fiction? A real sacred mountain, honoured continuously by multiple nations for thousands of years, with real ceremonial sites still in active use. A real active volcano with real caves, real thermal activity, and real atmospheric phenomena striking enough to fuel genuine visual mystery without anyone needing to invent anything. And a real religious movement founded in the 1930s that took root specifically because a mountain this visually commanding seems to invite exactly this kind of story, whether or not the story it eventually attracted had anything to do with the people who considered it sacred first. What can't be supported is the city. No archaeological survey, no geological mapping project, no cave expedition in over a century has produced a single piece of physical evidence for Telos, for Lemurian survivors, or for any hidden civilization beneath the mountain surface. The lava tubes that do exist have been explored. They lead nowhere resembling a city. The claim was never geological to begin with. It was literary, dressed up over several generations to look increasingly like testimony instead of the fiction it started as. And there's a real modern consequence buried underneath all of this borrowed mythology, one that has nothing to do with Lemuria at all. In 1988, the US Forest Service issued permits for a new ski area on Mount Shasta, with its base planned near Panther Meadow, a site containing sacred springs central to Wintu ceremonial practice, the same springs the Wintu still return to each year with the ritual dances meant to keep them flowing. Tribes objected immediately, and the resulting dispute became a genuine legal battle over religious freedom on federal land, working its way through the court system as tribes argued that development at that specific location would desecrate an active, still practiced sacred site. The ski area's original ski bowl location had already been destroyed by an avalanche in 1978, and the fight over where and whether to rebuild became a real test of how much weight American law gives to a living indigenous religious tradition when it conflicts with commercial development, a test case that, in various forms, has been repeated at sacred sites across the American West ever since, with mixed and often disappointing results for the tribes bringing the claims. That's the tension almost nobody discussing Telos ever mentions. While a fictional underground city populated by ascended beings and Lemurian refugees, was steadily absorbing more and more of Mount Shasta's cultural attention throughout the 20th century. The actual documented, currently practiced indigenous tradition tied to this mountain was fighting a real legal battle just to keep its sacred springs protected from a parking lot. So when you ask what native elders actually say is beneath Mount Shasta, the honest answer looks nothing like the version that made the mountain famous. It isn't a hidden city, and it was never meant to be treated as one. It's a place understood across 4 or 5 separate nations and thousands of years of unbroken tradition, as the exact point where the world itself began, a spring the Wintu still sing to every year, a summit the Klamath still describe as a spirit's chosen home, a mountain the Karuk still simply call white, the way you'd address something you consider both sacred and alive. The Lemurians were never real, but the reason their story managed to attach itself so successfully to this specific mountain and stay there for over 100 years was never really about lava tubes or lenticular clouds either. It was because Mount Shasta had already been treated as extraordinary by the people who knew it first for thousands of years before anyone thought to write a novel about it. And once a place has already earned that kind of reverence honestly, it turns out to be remarkably easy for someone else's fiction to move in and borrow it, dressing itself up in the same sense of awe the mountain had already been generating on its own for people who owed it nothing and invented nothing to feel it. There's a kind of quiet irony sitting at the center of all this. The fictional Lemurians were imagined as an advanced hidden civilization guarding ancient wisdom beneath the mountain. The actual advanced ancient tradition tied to Mount Shasta was never hidden at all. It was right there on the surface, practiced openly, for longer than most of the civilizations Oliver borrowed inspiration from had even existed, and it never needed an underground city to make the mountain worth protecting. Do you think Mount Shasta's fictional mythology has done more to draw attention to the mountain, or more to drown out the actual indigenous tradition it borrowed its sense of mystery from in the first place? Let me know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you in the next one.